Hi everybody, this is Johnny. I'm going to go through CalTPA Cycle 2, Step 3, Reflect. And this is from the Performance Assessment Guide from the fall of 2019. So let's get started. First off, Step 3 is all about looking at your assessments and analyzing them and making good sense of how your whole class did, but also looking at 3 particular students. So hold that in mind as we go through these together. So let's look at what the directions say. First off, analyze the formal assessment processes. It says directions: use your rubric to score student formal assessment responses. Determine the level of performance for each student in your class based on the rubric. Record student assessment results in the table provided in the template. All right, so it's all about the formal assessment here. And you want to be using the rubric that you set out as you planned for your unit. And you want to make sure that rubric is, as in your planning, just to be really, really strong. Just very clear, very specific towards the learning goals. And we'll talk about that in a moment. About the template, when they say the template, what you need to be thinking about is this box here. Okay. So you're going to be making some kind of organization like that. I suggest you do it for yourself first in some kind of table so you can see the kids' results in general, and then you can start analyzing it for yourself before you start setting things out in the template. Okay, so let's take a look at this again. All right. The next part, analyze the results for the whole class. Okay. And this is important because you need to think about the whole class, and then you need to think about 3 students. All right? And the way they set it out for the whole class, and this will matter with the 3 focus students too, the students that exceeded the learning goals, okay, the students in your class who met the learning goals, and the ones who need more instructional support, okay, did not quite meet the learning goals. All right? And so you'll need to be saying both which students didn't and did, but you also might want to be describing them as parts of the whole. So maybe you had 24 students and 16 of them met the goals, 3 exceeded, and some number didn't meet. So think about the whole class and describing things in that way. The next part is all about the 3 focus students. So based on your analysis of the results of the whole class, select 3 student responses to the formal assessment that demonstrate a range of performances. So you need to have 1 student who exceeded, 1 student who met, and finally a 3rd student who did not yet meet. All right, so that's going to be something you need to select. My suggestion is you want to make sure that those 3 students have interesting results. All right, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So let's look at what I've written here. First off, your reflection focuses on formal assessment. That's the big idea for this task, for this step. The next is use your formal assessment rubric to score each of your students. Organize the results in a table like the one in the template. Okay, that should be very clear, self-explanatory. And the more you make it like the one in the template, the better you'll be able to analyze it and then report back your findings. All right? And your rubric should have 3 levels: meets the learning goal, exceeds the learning goal, and needs more support. Okay? And the way that CalTPA describes it is did not yet meet. All right? And that's going to be important because step 4 in your activity is all about reteaching. So you want to be thinking about your whole class that way. So when you're sorting and analyzing your whole class, keep in mind that the students who did not yet meet are likely to be, and you have to choose this, are likely to be the students that you'll be reteaching in a different way the content that was set out in your learning segment. The other part of it is you could also choose from your analysis that group of students who exceeded the learning goals and choose to do extension activities with them for step 4, which is apply. All right, so we have this here: exceeds, meets, needs more. That's the framework to think about all of this. All right. Now, The next piece is choosing one exemplar from each category: exceeds, meets, or needs more. And as I said, these should be rich examples. All right. If you have a student who did not yet meet what was going on or the expectations for the learning goal, and their assessment just actually doesn't have much on it, and you can't say much about it, that one is going to be hard to analyze. If you have instead another student who did not yet meet the learning goals, but it's plain in their assessment the ways they were thinking, the confusions they had, the things that you might work on, that would probably be a better choice because that's the one you can write more about. The same with exceeds. Just because someone got everything right in some particular way or some special way, just, they have 100% on an assessment, does not mean that you'll be able to write much about it. Look for kids who exceeded and showed you some special way in which they exceeded. All right? Hope that makes sense. Okay? The next piece, let's look down here. This is important. Submit the formal assessment responses, product, process, or recorded performance for the 3 students with detailed content-specific rubric-based feedback. Okay? So feedback is a big deal. All right? So what I wrote here is try to submit student formal assessments that have some kind of comment from you. All right? So if you're doing some kind of written thing, you should have some written comment on that on that assessment. So whatever formal assessment, whether it was a problem-solving activity or some kind of essay or something, you've written something on it. Now, I suggest that you start by attaching the rubric itself to each of the student assessments. In other words, your rubric attached to the student's work and given back to them is a form of feedback. Now, don't take that as the limit. So you can imagine, you're using the assessment to evaluate the student's work. You've attached it to the student's work. They receive it back. They can look at the rubric and see how they've scored. But what you should do is you should add comment. Okay? You should add a comment underneath the rubric or as part of the rubric based on the result. And the thing about this particular comment is this is feedback that should be formative. So you can imagine saying something like, here's the score that you have on the rubric. You've done very well here. You need a little more work there. But then underneath, as part of your feedback, you suggest something they might do. Based on your results on problem number 3, or based on what you're thinking about in question number 4, think about this, do this, try this. Those are all worthwhile kinds of feedback that give direction to students' work. So just to repeat, if you're going to be smart about this last piece, this piece over here, attach your rubric results to the student's work itself and add comment. All right? That's probably the strongest way to go here. And you can imagine doing that for every one of the students who've done that formal assessment for your learning segment. All right? So let's go on to the next piece. All right. Make sure I get it in the right place for you. Not quite. There we go. All right. So this first box at the top is all practical work. So let's talk about it, make sure we get it straight. Excuse me. Important notes for submitting assessment responses. Before you scan student work to upload, label each piece of student work to reflect that the student exceeded, met, or did not yet meet the learning goal. Okay? And you should label that, and if you're going to actually include their rubric responses and your feedback on it, include that too. Don't think one will do the other. So plainly label at the top, however you want to do that the student met, exceeded, or did not yet meet the learning goal. Okay? The next piece is remove or cover each student's name. Okay? And the next piece is all about performance-based assessments. Submit the video or audio recordings of the 3 students' performances. Okay? with a range of performance noted in your written narrative. So when you write about the performance, you need to say which student you thought was exceeding, which student you thought met, which student you thought did not yet meet. Okay. And if you do process assessments, the same kind of thing. You need to be able to say in the video, in your written description of the video, which ones met, exceeded, and did not yet meet. All right? And the last part is when you upload your assessment responses for submission, you will be required to assign a label to your file, indicate whether it is response 1 exceeded goal, response 2 met goal, response 3 did not yet meet goal. In general, what you want to do is just make sure that you label everything, make sure all your artifacts are clear and what part they play in your assessment on the TPA, so that the assessor doesn't get lost and get distracted by, well, what do I have here? What am I thinking about here? You want to make sure that they're focused on the good quality of your work, not whether your artifacts are in order. All right? So let's go to the bottom part here. Directions. Provide the following information for your class using the template provided. Number 1, with respect to the learning goals from the learning segment, report on the content-specific progress of your whole class on the formal assessment. Complete the table below to briefly describe each learning goal and to provide the number or percentage of students who exceeded, met, or have not yet met the learning goals. Okay? So 2 pieces here. Whole class, all right? And then you want to divvy it up, okay? I would suggest that you also, for yourself or in some artifact, you make another column, and this would be all where you have your percentages, okay, of the whole class, all right? Or that would actually be at the bottom of the table or chart, and that would be good, okay? So you need to make maybe a bottom row where you say exceeded what percentage, okay, so let's do it this way, met what percentage, not yet met what percentage. Imagine the bottom row of your table doing those things, okay? And you could include the number from the whole as well. So, and one other thought about that, you might do better by just putting it as a fractional part of the whole. 5 out of 24, 10 out of 24. So whatever you want to do, you can fill in this bottom row with numbers or percents. All right? Let's go to number 2. Analyze the formal assessment results for the whole class in relation to the content and identify and describe emerging patterns. All right? Of the student errors, skills, and understandings for the whole class and for the 3 students that represent a range of performance. Cite evidence, and I'm going to highlight this one in red because this is the most important piece. Cite evidence from the assessment responses submitted for the 3 students. Okay. Taking this one apart, patterns, you want to see what's going on with your kids across the class. Were there certain things that many kids understood and did well by? Were there some particular things groups of or many students did not quite understand or get to? You want to describe those as patterns, all right? And then you also want to be looking at your 3 students, very particular things in theirs, so that you might have a student who has a pattern in their responses, okay? They did well by these kinds of questions, but they did not do well by these kinds of questions, all right? So there might be a pattern within any particular student's response as well. The big point here, as I said before, citing evidence. This is the most important part. When we get to the rubrics, you'll see that in order for you to get a good score, you have to have clear evidence that you've shown students' work and talked about, you know, what you found in that student's work in your analysis. So citing evidence is a big, big deal. All right, for number 3, for those students whose achievement did not yet meet the specific content-specific learning goals, okay, so did not yet meet, what do you need to do next? Okay, so this is asking you to project in the future. What do you need to do next instructionally to meet their content learning and language development needs. They've given you two things here. So this is anticipating step 4, which is apply, when you're going to be doing reteaching. Most of you will be doing reteaching. So this is setting you up to anticipate that and how you might go about your reteaching lesson. All right, so I'm going to go through this again with some of my notes on the side here. The first one, you want to label each student work with a note of where that work sits in the rubric: needs, more, meets, exceeds. That should be clear. Again, no names. And video for performance or process-focused assessment. You can do that and anticipate that as well. Okay. So what I wrote here is the left column of this table matters a lot. And I didn't talk about this yet, but you want to make sure this part here is really, really clear and done well. Make sure that these learning goals are the specific learning goals you set out in your planning and work to meet in your teaching. All right? Be careful with the number of learning goals. Fewer specific goals can be better measured and addressed in your teaching and assessment. You don't want to have 10 things here. It's best if you have 3, 4, maybe 5, and you want to make sure that those things are actually things you can see in student work. All right? They can't, whatever you set out here can't be vague, can't be, well, maybe I'll see it in students' work, maybe I won't. You have to be able to clearly see this. This column here should fit really, really tightly with your rubric, right? In fact, your rubric criteria, your success criteria, needs to be in this column. I also wrote, if you put too few learning goals in this step 1, then you probably didn't ask enough of your students, and you won't have much to say about what's going on with them. Most likely, in your planning, you set out 3 or 4 particular things that you want students to be able to do, show, know, explain, demonstrate, and those are the things that should be in this left column, all right? And the strength of those learning goals, the clarity of those learning goals, and your ability to see them in student work will play out in your analysis. And you want to make that's a big, big deal. So the left column of this table matters a lot. Okay. The next piece about patterns, let's go into that more deeply. Okay. If you're looking for patterns, consider your learning goals. Okay. So when you're looking at student work, what were common approaches some or many of your students took in response to instruction? Okay, and they're showing their response to instruction in your assessment. So looking at the formal assessment, did they all go about the problem solving in a particular way? Or did many of them go about the problem solving in a particular way? Or did a cluster of kids go about the problem solving in a particular way? Okay. Or you can think about patterns in writing. So if you think about how they sentence variation or rules of grammar or whatever else that you're looking at, where some kids showing one particular pattern, other kids a different way of going about things. So you're looking for common approaches across the assessments for your students. The other piece of this is looking for what common misunderstandings played out. So what misunderstandings did you find for any group or for the whole class? Okay. And if you have 3 or 4 students who all did the same thing that in a way that doesn't quite work, then that's a pattern, and note it, okay? And you might describe why you think they went about that particular misstep or showed that misunderstanding. So the next piece is you want to make sure that you're showing whole class patterns, and then you want to make sure that you also look for patterns within each of the 3 students' work. If there's a particular way they're not understanding it, then you want to make sure that you're describing what's happening for each one. In general, with the TPA, if they say give attention to 3 students, that means write some set of sentences or a short paragraph for each student. Don't clump them together when you're doing your analysis. You're showing that you're giving particular focused attention to each one. Focus student 1, da-da-da-da-da, and you write a paragraph. Focus student 2, a short paragraph. Focus student 3, a short paragraph. It'll strengthen your work, all right? And the last piece is Citing evidence is a big deal. In fact, it's one of the requirements, as I said before, of the rubrics. And you will not get scored. Your score will automatically drop if you are not good about citing evidence. Now, the evidence that you should cite are things that came from the assessment itself. Okay, you have your rubric attached to your student's work. You can pull out particular samples. You will see in number 3 that this student da-da-da-da-da. You will see that student's response to this, and this is such and such and such and such. So I scored a, exceeds or met or whatever it is that you did. So you want to be referencing, and this is the big point, referencing 2 things. Referencing the student work itself with samples and referencing your assessment results. Okay, so those 2 things are the evidence that you want to be using. All right? And as I say here, pull specific examples from student work to justify your analysis. Okay? And the last piece, and this all connects to this piece down here. Okay, and this part you have to give good attention to. Use evidence from student work to justify the planned support for the students. So now we're citing evidence again. You have to have good reason for working with the students you're going to be reteaching, and that's what number 3 is all about. Why are you working with these 3 students? And your justification has to come from their work and your analysis of it in evident in your scoring on the rubric. Okay, that's the justification for that. All right, you look at the work, you cite samples and say, based on these 3 students' responses to number 3, I will need to reteach them in such and such and such and such. So you just need to make sure you're citing evidence. I'm going to say, be smart and careful about this. And the reason to be smart and careful about this is that you will most likely be doing step 4 based on this one. In fact, you should be. All right? So give good attention to this one. All of step 4 will be about this for most of you. All right? So a little bit more on this. Okay. All right, almost there. Okay, here we are. Okay, so step 3 was all about sorting out which students need more attention. So step 4 here is all about your feedback. And remember, I suggested you attach your feedback to your rubric, to the student's individual assessments. Okay? So you see quite plainly here, type of detailed feedback you give the whole class. Okay, so this is where you look at the patterns, and so everything here with the whole class is based on the patterns, and it's probably how you should write it up. Based on the patterns I've seen in the whole class assessment results, these are the things I need to be giving to my students to help them get better or to understand the results. So go back to the part about the patterns. For student 1, specific entities, specific prompts. You might think about that for students 1, 2, and 3. Based on how they did on problem number 3, these are the things I should work on with this student. Again, you're citing evidence. You're being specific about their work. All right? And the next piece about this is, how will you assist the whole class and these individuals to use the feedback to revise their work in order to take next steps to advance their learning. Okay, so this is support to use feedback. And let's look over here on the right-hand side. Maybe this will help. Okay, when you're thinking about the feedback, you want to use the language of the rubric in your feedback. Okay, so whatever learning goal you have, make sure you're using that type of language in your feedback to your students, because then you're getting back on the same page with them. Everybody is clear on what the learning goals were and what needs to be worked on. So I'll say it again. In your feedback, use the language from your rubric, okay, and from your learning goals. Now, this is a different piece down here. Your feedback must be specific, timely, and doable. All right? So let's get back to the specific part. If you are using the language of the rubric, then you're being specific. Okay? It's not about maybe you should spend your time better. You're actually going back and saying, maybe you should think about this problem in this particular way and try this approach, or consider these two approaches to solving this problem. Okay? Or in writing, it might be maybe you want to use this particular kind of tool, reference guide, etc., something specific that students should do to improve. So beside the specificity, the next part is timely. You want to make sure that whatever feedback you're giving your kids, they can do in a reasonable time. So it's something, if you give a bit of feedback, it should be something that the students can take back and work on right away. And within a few sessions or even one session, they can get better. You don't want to suggest a lifetime of change in your feedback. You can't say poor feedback would be, you would do better by this if you just concentrated better. That's not specific and that's not timely. All right? A better kind of feedback would be, try these 3 steps to improve this way of going about the problem solving. Right? So it's something that kids can do right away. The timeliness also has to do with how soon after an assessment event you give the feedback. If your students are given an assessment and they don't get the results back for a couple weeks, then it won't matter to them, and whatever you do with it is lost. So the idea behind timeliness with feedback is that they have an assessment and a couple days later they get the assessment back and you actually do something with it, which is the last one. Whatever kind of feedback you give students should be something they can actually do. You can imagine those students at whatever level they are and however they succeeded or not succeeded on the assessment, can do something with. All right? Okay, so let's go to the next piece, which is B, which is the how will you assist piece. You need to work with students to make sure they are able to use the feedback. What tools, materials, directions, classroom engagement will allow them to make use of their feedback. Okay? Do write about both the whole class and your 3 focus students in this regard. All right? And that's because that's how it's set out here, whole class and individuals. Okay? So sometimes the feedback you give feedback to students and they might just need some particular different approach or different tool to be able to take that feedback and do something to improve their learning. That's what you should describe with B. All right, so I'm going to move on to reflection on assessments and next steps for learning. So directions, based on your summary and analysis of student learning from the informal assessment, this is important here, student self-assessment, formal assessment, and evidence from the learning segment video clips. They give you 4 things here to consider now. Everything in part 1 was about the formal assessment. Okay. Part 2 is about all 4. So you're drawing from lots of different evidence. Informal assessment, student self-assessment, formal assessment, and from your video clips. Okay. What you want to do here is reflect on what you learned about student progress toward meeting the learning goals. Okay. And then you have to respond to the prompts below. And we'll talk about citing evidence in a moment too. That's going to be important again. So, as I wrote here, you must focus on all 3 assessments here, the informal, the student self-assessment, and the formal assessment. Those are the essential pieces, but the other piece they allow here is that you can reference the videos. Remember, your videos are labeled, and so you want to say in, video clip 2, whatever your label is, at 3:22 in the video, you will see. So you want to use that as evidence too. All right? So going to the next part, all of this piece down here is about you describing your teaching. This is where you describe how and what these assessments tell you about your students and their work towards meeting the learning goals. Okay, you're telling the story. And the pieces of the story are the assessments and the videos. Okay, what's the story of your students' learning based on what you've gotten out of, what you've learned from these assessments and from what you've watched and seen in the videos. Okay, use the videos and the assessments as evidence. Again, can't emphasize this enough. Cite evidence throughout. As I've said before, in the rubrics for these sections, for the last pieces of CalTPA Cycle 2, it's all about citing evidence. All right, just be prepared for that from the onset. Cite evidence, cite evidence, cite evidence. Okay, so let's take a look at this piece here, A and B. First off, it says, think about your teaching practice during the learning segment and what you've learned from your analysis of multiple types of assessment about your students' understanding of the learning goals. A is all about what's most effective, and B about things that weren't quite effective. So let's think about these here. When you're looking at A, what was most effective? When you are given a choice, teaching or assessment or both, what about your teaching? Okay, so you need to think about both of these. What about your teaching helps students toward the learning goals? Okay. And the second piece is, what about the assessments helped you and them towards the learning goals? So you want to make sure you address both of these. It says here, what was most effective about your teaching or assessment? If they give you an or, it's probably best to address both of them. So what worked well in your teaching? And then, what did the assessments do to help you with your teaching? So that's all about A. Try to do both of those. And B, what was least effective? You can see again, your teaching or assessment. So what was least effective again? About your teaching and about the use of assessments to move students toward the learning goals. Okay? Think about the assessments not just as the assessments told you whether you did a good job teaching or not, but also describe how informal assessment, student self-assessment, and feedback helped change the teaching, adjust the teaching, make it better or not. In this case, it's about you gave, or maybe that informal assessment didn't quite tell you as much as you wanted, or the student self-assessment didn't get to the richer, deeper things that they should have considered. So this is where you analyze that and think about your own use of assessment critically. So 2 parts here, your teaching, and then about assessments again. Hold on to those. Okay? And the evidence to be submitted, you've got formal assessments from 3 students. All right? And you could see the labeling here. And then you've got the written narrative where you're describing all the things we've set out here. All right? So I hope this has been helpful. If I have any last words for part 3, it's about critical consideration of your teaching using first, part 1, the formal assessments, part 2, critical consideration of your teaching using all the assessment types and videos for part 2 of this step 3, and then in both parts, citing evidence, citing evidence, citing evidence. And I think the big takeaway that you might want to hold on to is make everything in line. So in your rubric, in your criteria for your rubric, should set out your table for part 1, making sure that you're analyzing across those particular things in your rubric. Those criteria in your rubric have to be absolutely aligned with your learning goals. So that's important. And then the other part is about artifacts. Your student assessments should probably be attached to your rubrics. Rubric result for each of your students should be attached to each student's assessment, and each rubric should have some place or just added a note that you give feedback to your students. So imagine each student assessment has 3 parts: the assessment itself, the rubric with your scoring, and some formative feedback comment. And if you were to do that for each student, you'd be in a great place. So I hope this was helpful. And I'm going to go on to step 4.